In the sweltering heat of July 1944, within the gray concrete walls of Dachau concentration camp, northwest of Munich, Germany, a group of 90 men were about to become subjects in an experiment that their doctors believed would save lives. These physicians, respected members of the medical community, educated at prestigious universities, holders of advanced degrees and positions of authority, genuinely thought they were conducting legitimate scientific research. They had convinced themselves and attempted to convince others that what they were about to do served a greater purpose, a military necessity, in a time of total war. But what these doctors didn't know, or perhaps what they refused to acknowledge, was that their seawater cure was hiding something far more sinister. A death sentence wrapped in the language of science, justified by wartime urgency and carried out with methodical precision. This is the story of how medical ethics were abandoned, how human beings were reduced to laboratory specimens, and how the veneer of scientific legitimacy concealed acts of profound cruelty. Before we continue with this important historical account, I want to ask you to take a moment to hit that like button if you're finding this content valuable. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories about World War II history, and please leave a comment below letting me know what aspects of this period interest you most. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these crucial historical narratives to light. Now let's step back to understand the world in which these events unfolded. By the summer of 1944, Germany's military situation had become desperate. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded on June 6th. American and British forces were pushing through France. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly, having already pushed German forces out of much of the territory they had occupied. In the skies above Germany, Allied bombers flew in massive formations day and night, targeting industrial centers, fuel refineries, and transportation networks. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was losing pilots at an unsustainable rate. Young aviators, many with minimal training due to fuel shortages and the compressed nature of their instruction, were being sent into combat against increasingly overwhelming odds. When these German pilots were shot down over water, whether over the English Channel, the North Sea, the Baltic, or the Mediterranean, their chances of survival depended on multiple factors. The Luftwaffe had developed an impressive air-sea rescue service called the Seenothdienst, which operated flying boats and seaplanes specifically designed to recover downed airmen. These rescue aircraft, often painted white with Red Cross markings, would search vast expanses of ocean looking for men in rubber rafts or floating in life jackets. The service had saved thousands of lives since the beginning of the war. But as German-controlled territory shrank and Allied air superiority grew, the effectiveness of these rescue operations diminished. More and more pilots found themselves adrift at sea for extended periods, facing the twin threats of exposure and dehydration. This was the military problem that prompted the seawater experiments. If a pilot could survive for an extended period drinking seawater while awaiting rescue, it could mean the difference between life and permanent loss. The human kidneys, however, cannot process the high salt concentration in seawater. When you drink seawater, your body must use more water to eliminate the excess salt than you gained from drinking it in the first place. The result is accelerated dehydration, not hydration. This basic physiological fact was well understood in 1944, but there were theories about chemical treatments that might make seawater drinkable, and it was this question that the experiments at Dachau were ostensibly designed to answer. Enter Dr. Hans Eppinger. Born in Prague in January of 1879, Eppinger came from a distinguished medical family. His father was a professor of pathology. Young Hans received an excellent education in medicine, earning his doctorate in 1903 from the University of Graz. He specialized in internal medicine, with a particular focus on liver diseases and metabolism. Over the decades, he built an impressive academic career. He taught at Freiburg, then Cologne, and by 1930 eventually became professor and director of the first medical clinic at the prestigious Allgemeines Krankenhaus in Vienna, one of the largest hospitals in Europe. His research was respected, his clinical skills acknowledged. Medical terms and syndromes bore his name. In 1936, he even traveled to Moscow to treat Joseph Stalin himself, such was his international reputation. But Hans Eppinger also joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party in May of 1938, shortly after the annexation of Austria into Germany. His membership number was 6,164,614. He was not a reluctant participant or a token member. His house served as a meeting place for party cells at the University of Vienna. Nearly all of his assistant physicians and senior staff were members of the SS or SA, the paramilitary organizations of the party. Eppinger was described as holding a leading position within the party structure. He was a man who saw opportunity in the new regime, who aligned himself with those in power, and who was willing to use the resources that regime provided to further his research ambitions. Alongside Eppinger was Dr. Wilhelm Beigelbuck, born in October of 1905. Beigelbuck was younger, a generation removed from his superior. He had studied at the University of Vienna and worked his way up through the medical hierarchy at Eppinger's clinic, becoming Eppinger's first senior physician by April of 1939. Like his mentor, Beigelbuck had joined the party early in 1933 and the SA in 1934, eventually reaching the rank of Obersturmbannführer, equivalent to lieutenant colonel. He held the title of consulting physician to the Luftwaffe during the war. He was considered an expert in vitamin research and nutritional issues. When the question of seawater potability arose within Luftwaffe medical circles, Beigelbuck was selected to conduct the research. According to his later testimony, he would have preferred to conduct these experiments in a hospital ward, with volunteers under controlled medical conditions, but that's not what happened. Instead, he was ordered to Dachau. Dachau. The name itself had become synonymous with terror by 1944. It was the first concentration camp established by the regime, opening on March 22, 1933, less than 2 months after the party took power. Initially designed to hold 5,000 political prisoners, primarily communists, social democrats, and trade unionists, it had evolved over 11 years into something far more comprehensive in its brutality. By 1944, Dachau held tens of thousands of prisoners from across occupied Europe. Political prisoners, certainly, but also Jews, Roma people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholic clergy, Soviet prisoners of war, resistance fighters from a dozen countries, and countless others deemed enemies or undesirables by the regime. The camp's conditions had deteriorated dramatically as the war turned against Germany. What had once been designed for 5,000 now held over 30,000 in the main camp alone, with tens of thousands more in satellite work camps scattered across southern Germany. Food rations were grossly insufficient. The water supply was contaminated. Sanitation facilities were overwhelmed. Typhus epidemics swept through the barracks, claiming hundreds of lives every month. The death rate, which had been perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 per year in the early years of the war, had skyrocketed. In October of 1944, over 400 would perish. In November, that number doubled. By December, nearly 2,000 individuals would lose their lives in a single month. The crematorium couldn't keep pace with the death rate. Bodies were stacked outside in the cold. In some cases, prisoners were forced to dig mass graves to handle the overflow. This was the setting into which 90 Roma men were brought in early August of 1944. The Roma, also known as gypsies, a term many consider pejorative, had been targeted by the regime since its earliest days. They were declared racially inferior, subjected to forced sterilization, barred from certain professions and areas, and eventually marked for complete elimination. Hundreds of thousands of Roma would perish during the war, a genocide that remains less well known than other atrocities of the period, but was no less systematic or brutal. The 90 men selected for the Seawater experiments had been transferred from Buchenwald concentration camp. They were designated with the prisoner classification ASR, which stood for Arbeitsscheu Reich, supposedly meaning work-shy or habitually avoiding work, a label applied to Roma and others the regime deemed socially undesirable. This label was itself a fiction, a bureaucratic designation that had nothing to do with actual work habits and everything to do with ethnic persecution. These men, whose names we largely don't know, whose faces were never recorded for posterity, whose families may never have learned exactly what happened to them, were about to endure an ordeal that survivors would later describe as worse than they could have imagined. One of them, a man named Karl Hollenreiner, would later provide testimony about what occurred. His words, translated from German, give us one of the few first-person accounts of the experiments from a victim's perspective. In his statement given in 1947, he described arriving at Dachau at the beginning of August 1944 with the other 39 Roma men from his transport group. They were told they would be participating in a medical experiment. The exact nature of what they were told at this initial stage remains unclear, but given the power dynamics involved, given that refusal was not an option, given that these were imprisoned men under the absolute control of the SS and the camp administration, the concept of voluntary participation was a cruel fiction. The experimental protocol, as designed by Eppinger and Beigelbuck, called for several distinct groups. According to testimony given at the Nuremberg medical trial after the war, all test subjects first received full airman rations for 10 days. These were the same 3,000-calorie meals provided to Luftwaffe pilots. The purpose was to establish a baseline, to ensure all subjects started from roughly the same nutritional state. After this preparatory period, the subjects were divided into different experimental groups. One group was forced to starve completely, receiving no food and no water whatsoever. Another group received Luftwaffe sea rations, the emergency food supplies carried by pilots, but was given seawater treated with a chemical additive called wolfetit. This substance was supposed to remove enough salt to make the water drinkable. A third group received seawater treated with a different chemical process called Birka water. A fourth group, serving as a control, was allowed to drink normal fresh water. The experiments began in earnest. For the men in the starvation group, the suffering was immediate and intense. Imagine being denied all food and water. Your mouth becomes dry almost immediately. Your throat feels like sandpaper. Within hours, you're thinking about nothing but water. Your body begins to consume itself, breaking down fat reserves, then muscle tissue. You become weak. Standing requires effort. Thinking clearly becomes difficult. After the first day, you might feel dizzy when you stand. After 2 days, you're likely experiencing severe headaches. By the third day, your urine has turned dark, thick with waste products your kidneys are desperately trying to eliminate. Your skin loses its elasticity. If someone pinches your skin, it stays pinched, tented, because there's not enough water in your tissues to return to normal shape. For the men forced to drink seawater, the experience was different, but no less horrific. Seawater contains approximately 35 grams of salt per liter, mostly sodium chloride, but also magnesium, sulfate, and calcium. When you drink this, your kidneys must work to eliminate the salt. But to do so, they need water, more water than was in the seawater you just consumed. So you actually become more dehydrated. You feel thirstier than before. So you drink more seawater. The cycle continues. Your blood sodium levels rise, a condition called hypernatremia. This affects your brain function. You may experience confusion, agitation, seizures. Your muscles cramp painfully. Diarrhea sets in, further depleting your body's water and electrolytes. You're trapped in a vicious cycle where the thing you're drinking to quench your thirst is actually hastening your deterioration. The men subjected to this experienced physical torments that went beyond simple thirst. Several survivors reported that the experimental subjects became so desperately thirsty that they would lick the floors immediately after they had been mopped, trying to get any moisture they could. They would drink water from anywhere they could find it. One account mentions men desperately seeking out old floor rags that had been used for cleaning, wringing them out, trying to extract any droplets of water they contained. The human drive to find water when severely dehydrated is overwhelming, primal, beyond rational thought. These men were experiencing that drive in its most extreme form while being observed and having their reactions meticulously recorded. But the torment didn't stop with forced dehydration. The experimental protocol called for invasive medical procedures to monitor the subject's deterioration. Liver punctures were performed on multiple subjects. This procedure involves inserting a large needle through the abdominal wall and into the liver to extract tissue samples. It's painful under the best circumstances, even with anesthesia and sterile technique. There's no indication these men received adequate anesthesia, if any at all. Karl Hellenreiner, in his testimony, said, quote, "I myself received a liver puncture and know from my own experience that these punctures were terribly painful. Even today, when the weather changes, I feel severe pain where the liver puncture was performed," end quote. This was stated 2 years after the experiments. The physical trauma had left permanent nerve damage, chronic pain that would afflict him for the rest of his life. Spinal taps were also performed. This involves inserting a needle between the vertebrae and the lower back to extract cerebrospinal fluid. Again, this is an invasive, painful procedure. Done without proper anesthesia on dehydrated, malnourished subjects, it would have been excruciating. The supposed purpose was to monitor changes in the subject's biochemistry as they deteriorated, to gather scientific data about the effects of seawater consumption and dehydration. But the medical value of such data gathered under these conditions is questionable at best. The experimental subjects were not in controlled conditions. They were already suffering from malnutrition and the effects of imprisonment. Their baseline health was compromised. The data being gathered was being extracted through procedures that caused additional suffering and trauma. This wasn't science. It was torture disguised as research. The experiments continued through July and into August and September of 1944. Different accounts provide varying timelines, but the consensus is that the active experimental phase lasted several weeks at minimum. Throughout this period, Eppinger made multiple visits to Dachau to observe the experiments. Later attempts by his defenders to claim he was not directly involved were demonstrably false. There are records of him visiting the camp together with other SS researchers, inspecting the experimental setup, observing the subjects. Beigelbuck was present throughout, directly supervising the protocol, making decisions about which subjects received what treatments, ordering the invasive procedures, recording the results. Both men knew exactly what was happening. Both were active participants. Both bore direct responsibility. The suffering of the 90 men was not abstract. It was not a matter of clinical observations recorded in neat handwriting in laboratory notebooks. It was human beings experiencing the slow destruction of their bodies while being told this served a higher purpose. Karl Hellenreiner described how, during the experiments, he had terrible thirst attacks. He felt very ill. He lost a significant amount of weight. By the end, he developed a fever and felt so weak he could no longer stand on his feet. This description matches classic symptoms of severe dehydration and hypernatremia. The fever suggests his body's regulatory systems were failing. The inability to stand indicates profound muscular weakness and possible neurological effects. He was, in medical terms, approaching organ failure. Miraculously, somehow, all 90 men survived the experiments themselves. This fact would later be used by defenders of Eppinger and Beigelbuck to argue that no permanent harm was done, that the experiments were conducted within acceptable boundaries, that the doctors had acted responsibly by stopping before any subjects perished. This argument is grotesque. The fact that the men didn't perish during the experiments doesn't mean they weren't gravely harmed. Höllenreiner's chronic pain years later demonstrates lasting physical damage. The psychological trauma of being subjected to such an ordeal, of being treated as less than human, of having your suffering observed and recorded with clinical detachment, leaves scars that never fully heal. And we must remember that these 90 men, having survived the experiments, were returned to the general camp population at Dachau. In late 1944, Dachau was experiencing death rates of hundreds per month. The typhus epidemic was raging. Many, perhaps most, of these 90 men likely did not survive until the camp's liberation in April of 1945. Their survival of the experiments proved temporary. As 1944 turned to 45, Germany's collapse accelerated. The Eastern Front crumbled. Budapest fell to Soviet forces in February. Vienna would fall in April. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March. The war was clearly ending, and those who had committed atrocities began to consider what would come next. Hans Eppinger, 67 years old, with his international medical reputation and his treatment of Stalin still remembered, initially believed he might weather the storm. When Soviet forces occupied Vienna, they appreciated his medical skills and used him as a consulting physician. He could no longer enter his own clinic, relegated to working in a nearby private hospital, but he was at least practicing medicine. But as the full scope of the regime's crimes became known, as the Allies began gathering evidence for what would become the Nuremberg trials, Eppinger's name appeared on lists. His role in the Dachau experiments could not be concealed. Documents existed. Witnesses survived. On September 25, 1946, 1 month before he was scheduled to testify at the Nuremberg medical trial, Hans Eppinger took his own life using poison. He was found with a Swiss bank account that had never been claimed, money set aside, perhaps, for an escape that never materialized. His exit from history was through self-inflicted means, avoiding accountability, avoiding having to face his victims, avoiding having to explain how he had justified what he had done. Wilhelm Bagelböck did not escape. He was arrested by British forces, then transferred to American custody. In December of 1946, he stood trial before the Nuremberg military tribunals, one of 23 defendants in what became known as the Doctor's Trial. The prosecution presented evidence of the Seawater experiments. They showed the court documents outlining the experimental protocol. They presented testimony from survivors. Karl Höllenreiner was brought to Nuremberg to testify. When he saw Bagelböck in the courtroom, this man who had supervised his torment, Höllenreiner reportedly jumped over the barrier of the dock with a mighty leap and gave Bagelböck what one newspaper called a terrible punch in the face, shouting, "This rascal ruined my life." Court guards had to physically restrain him. Höllenreiner was sentenced to 90 days in Nuremberg prison for contempt of court, but was released after 3 weeks when he apologized. The incident illustrated the raw, visceral trauma that survivors carried. Bagelböck's defense strategy was predictable. He claimed he had been ordered against his will to perform the experiments. He insisted that the subjects were volunteers in good health. He maintained that if any tests became dangerous, he stopped them. He presented himself as a physician who had acted within acceptable medical boundaries under difficult wartime circumstances. His lawyer, Gustav Steinbauer, argued vigorously for his client, though Steinbauer's conduct during the trial was later heavily criticized. He accepted Bagelböck's manipulation of evidence before submitting it to the court. He did not release a list of victims' names. He allowed Bagelböck to defame those who had been experimented upon, portraying them as unreliable witnesses, as criminals, as less worthy of consideration. The prosecution argued differently. They contended that the experiments violated every principle of medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code, which emerged from this trial, would establish 10 principles for ethical human experimentation, and the Dachau seawater experiments violated virtually all of them. There was no voluntary consent. The subjects were prisoners with no ability to refuse. The experiments were not necessary, as the basic science about seawater and human physiology was already well established. The experiments caused severe suffering without commensurate benefit. The risks far exceeded any potential scientific gain. The experimenters did not have the right to conduct such research on captive populations. On August 20, 1947, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Wilhelm Beigelbuch was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 15 years' imprisonment. But here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. After his conviction, Beigelbuch did not serve his full sentence. In fact, he served only 4 years. The German Society of Internal Medicine, a professional organization of physicians, campaigned actively for his rehabilitation. A 3-member commission was formed, consisting of prominent doctors, including Kurt Wimmer, Rudolf Schoen, and Ludwig Heilmeyer. These physicians, along with several others, including Franz Volhard, Paul Martini, Hans Erhard Bock, Wolfgang Heubner, and the physiologists Hermann Rhein and Hans Netter, prepared expert opinions arguing for Beigelbuch's innocence. These expert opinions engaged in what can only be called historical revisionism. They claimed that the test subjects had been volunteers. They asserted that no deaths or long-term damage had occurred. They argued that Beigelbuch had acted with the best medical intentions. Critically, these expert opinions were based entirely on files submitted by Beigelbuch's lawyer. None of these expert physicians had examined any of the actual victims. Most had never even met Beigelbuch personally. They were providing professional cover for a convicted war criminal based on carefully curated documentation. The campaign succeeded. In December of 1951, before Christmas, Wilhelm Beigelbuch was released from Landsberg prison. His sentence had been commuted to 10 years. Then he was released early for time served and good behavior. What happened next is almost as shocking as the original crimes. Beigelbuch returned to medical practice. He worked in hospitals in Germany. In 1956, just 5 years after his release from prison, he was elected to the committee of the German Society of Internal Medicine, the same organization that had campaigned for his release. He served on that committee until 1962. The medical establishment in post-war Germany, in other words, welcomed him back with open arms. At a meeting in 1964, a DGIM official declared that Wilhelm Beigelbuch was a true student of Eppinger, rich in fruitful thoughts, whose brilliant rise at the Vienna Clinic had been abruptly and undeservedly interrupted by the misfortune of his detachment to carry out the so-called seawater experiments. Undeservedly interrupted. Misfortune. The so-called seawater experiments, as if there was some question about whether they had actually occurred. The official then stated that the review by the DGIM Commission had absolved Beigelbuch of any guilt. In 1962, the Austrian Medical Association invited Beigelbuch to give a medical lecture in Vienna. There was opposition from the Social Democratic Party and the local Jewish community. But the administrative committee of the city of Buxtehude publicly supported Beigelbuch, stating he was not guilty of the crimes for which he had been convicted. Eventually, after public pressure, the invitation was rescinded. In 1959, the public prosecutor in Buckeberg opened a new investigation against Beigelbuch, but dropped the case in 1960. In November of 1963, Wilhelm Beigelbuch was found deceased in a stairwell. The circumstances of his passing remain unclear. Some claimed he was taken by his own hand. Others suggested foul play, noting that he had received threatening letters prior to his end. An organization called Stille Hilfe, which provided relief for former SS members, was named as his official heir. Even in the manner of his exit, questions and controversies surrounded him. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Beiglböck's supporters continued to insist that the prisoners had volunteered, that the experiments had been harmless, that he had been completely exonerated. This narrative persisted despite the testimony of survivors like Karl Hollenreiner, despite the documentary evidence presented at Nuremberg, despite the conviction by an international tribunal. The rehabilitation of Beiglböck illustrated how post-war German society, particularly its medical establishment, struggled to confront the crimes committed by physicians during the Third Reich era. Hans Eppinger's legacy followed a similar trajectory of evasion and rehabilitation. In 1976, 30 years after his passing, the International Astronomical Union named a crater on the Moon after him, Eppinger Crater, honoring his contributions to medical science. Medical terms continued to bear his name, including Cauchois-Eppinger, Frugoni syndrome, later renamed to portal vein thrombosis to remove his association. In 1973, the Falk Foundation of Freiburg established an Eppinger Prize for outstanding contributions to liver research. When Eppinger's activities at Dachau were brought to public attention in 1984, 40 years after the events, the prize was finally canceled. In 2002, after the Lunar Republic Society and others brought Eppinger's connection to the experiments to the attention of the Working Group for Planetary System Nomenclature, the crater on the Moon was renamed. Eppinger's name was stripped from it, a small act of posthumous accountability. These efforts to honor and rehabilitate Eppinger and Beiglböck weren't isolated incidents. They reflected a broader pattern in post-war Germany and Austria of minimizing, rationalizing, and sometimes denying the crimes committed by medical professionals during the war. Many doctors who had participated in forced sterilization, so-called euthanasia programs, and human experimentation continued their careers after the war with minimal consequences. The medical establishment protected its own, prioritizing professional loyalty over ethical accountability. So what was the scientific value of the Dachau seawater experiments? What did Eppinger and Beiglböck discover that justified in their minds what they had done? The answer is effectively nothing. The basic physiology of seawater consumption and human kidneys was already understood before the experiments began. The chemical treatments tested, Wolfetit and Birka water, did not prove to be practical solutions. No breakthrough emerged from this research that saved lives or advanced medical knowledge in any meaningful way. The experiments produced data that was scientifically worthless because the conditions under which it was gathered made it impossible to control for variables, impossible to establish reliable baselines, impossible to separate the effects of seawater from the effects of starvation, imprisonment, and pre-existing malnutrition. In the decades since, there have been debates about whether data from unethical experiments should ever be used by later researchers. Some argue that if the data can save lives, it would be equally unethical not to use it, that the victim's suffering should at least produce some lasting benefit. Others argue on purely ethical grounds that using such data legitimizes the methods used to obtain it, that it treats human beings as means rather than ends, that it violates the dignity of the victims. Still others have rejected the data on scientific grounds, noting that experiments conducted under conditions of coercion and cruelty are unlikely to produce reliable results. In the case of the Dachau seawater experiments, the scientific critique aligns with the ethical one. The data was both immorally obtained and scientifically unreliable. The Nuremberg medical trial, which concluded in August of 1947, resulted in convictions for 16 of the 23 defendants. 7 were sentenced to face capital punishment and were later given lethal injections. 9 received prison sentences of varying lengths. 7 were acquitted. The trial produced the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles that have guided ethical medical research ever since. The first and most fundamental principle states that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. The Dachau experiments, where imprisoned men under the absolute control of their captors were subjected to potentially lethal research, represented the complete opposite of this principle. The Nuremberg Code has since been supplemented by the Declaration of Helsinki, by national regulations governing human subjects research, by institutional review boards, and by countless additional protections. But these safeguards exist precisely because of what happened at Dachau and other sites where medical ethics were abandoned. The 90 Roma men who suffered in those experiments were not abstract victims. They were individuals with names, families, hopes, dreams, all of which were disregarded by physicians who saw them as experimental material. Karl Hullenreiner, whose testimony we've relied upon, survived the war and lived with chronic pain for the rest of his life. We know his name because he was brave enough to testify. The other 89, we mostly don't know. Their individual stories, their fates, remain largely undocumented. They were among the hundreds of thousands of Roma people who were targeted, persecuted, and in many cases exterminated during the war. Their suffering in the Seawater experiments was part of a larger genocide that remains less well known and less memorialized than other atrocities of the period. The broader history of Dachau concentration camp is now well documented. Over 206,000 registered prisoners passed through the camp between 1933 and 1945. Over 41,000 lost their lives there, though the real number is certainly higher as many deaths went unrecorded, particularly among Soviet prisoners of war. The camp was liberated by American forces on April 29, 1945. Soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army found approximately 32,000 survivors in conditions of indescribable squalor, piles of corpses that hadn't been processed through the crematorium. Survivors who were literally skeletons, so emaciated that some weighed less than 80 pounds as adult men. A typhus epidemic still raging. Even after liberation, 50 to 80 prisoners per day continued to perish from the effects of their imprisonment, from diseases too advanced to treat, from bodies too damaged to recover. The campsite was preserved, and in 1965, a memorial was established. Today, the Dachau concentration camp memorial site receives over 800,000 visitors per year. People from around the world come to bear witness, to remember, to ensure that what happened there is not forgotten. The memorial includes preserved barracks, the crematorium building, extensive documentation, and educational exhibits. It serves as a place of remembrance for victims and as a site of historical education about the dangers of totalitarianism, the fragility of democratic institutions, and the consequences of unchecked prejudice and hatred. Within that broader history, the Seawater experiments represent a specific case study in the corruption of medical ethics. Eppinger and Begelbuck were not sadists. By most accounts, they saw themselves as scientists, as physicians, as men pursuing legitimate research questions. They convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, that it served a greater good, that the military need for improved survival techniques justified the means. They rationalized and compartmentalized. They used the language of science to obscure the reality of cruelty. And they were enabled by a system that had removed all ethical constraints, that had declared certain groups of people to be subhuman, that had created a bureaucracy capable of processing human beings through camps as if they were industrial products. The lesson here is not that Eppinger and Begelbuck were uniquely evil monsters, so different from ordinary people that we can comfortably distance ourselves from their actions. The lesson is precisely the opposite. They were educated, accomplished professionals who step by step, decision by decision, compromised their ethics until they found themselves conducting experiments that caused profound suffering for no valid scientific purpose. They demonstrate how professional identity, institutional loyalty, wartime urgency, and ideological commitment can combine to override individual moral judgment. They show us that the Hippocratic Oath's promise to first do no harm is not self-enforcing, that it requires constant vigilance, institutional safeguards, and the courage to refuse participation in unethical practices even when authorities demand compliance. The post-war rehabilitation of Beigelbuck by the German medical establishment shows another troubling lesson. Confronting past wrongs requires more than formal tribunals and legal proceedings. It requires a willingness by professional communities to hold their own members accountable, to acknowledge that credentials and expertise do not exempt anyone from moral responsibility. The German Society of Internal Medicine's campaign to exonerate Beigelbuck, the honors attempted for Eppinger, these represented a failure of professional self-examination, a prioritizing of guild loyalty over ethical standards. That failure allowed men who had committed serious crimes to return to positions of respect and authority, sending a message that professional standing could insulate one from consequences. Looking back from our present moment, we can see the Seawater experiments as part of a larger pattern of medical crimes during the war years. There were the freezing experiments at Dachau, where prisoners were immersed in ice water to study hypothermia. There were high-altitude experiments using pressure chambers to simulate conditions at extreme altitudes, often causing permanent brain damage or ending lives. There were malaria experiments, infecting prisoners to test various treatments. There were sterilization experiments, bone grafting attempts, poison testing, and countless other projects where human beings were treated as laboratory animals. All of these were justified at the time with rhetoric about military necessity, scientific progress, and the greater good. All of them caused suffering. None of them produced scientific insights that justified the means used to obtain them. The doctors who conducted these experiments were prosecuted at Nuremberg, and that trial established crucial precedents. But many physicians who participated in less dramatic but still deeply unethical activities in forced sterilization programs, so-called euthanasia operations, and the medical evaluation of prisoners continued their careers after the war with minimal disruption. The full reckoning with medical complicity in atrocities took decades and remains incomplete even today. For us, more than 80 years after these events, the story of the Dachau seawater experiments offers several enduring lessons. First, we must remember the victims. The 90 Roma men whose suffering we've discussed were real people, not abstract statistics. Remembering them means acknowledging their humanity, their inherent dignity, and the injustice of what was done to them. Second, we must remain vigilant about the ethical boundaries of medical research. The Nuremberg Code and subsequent protections exist because these boundaries were catastrophically violated. Those protections must be defended and strengthened, not eroded in the name of scientific progress or expedience. Third, we must recognize how professional communities can enable wrongdoing through silence, rationalization, and active rehabilitation of those who have committed serious ethical breaches. Accountability requires institutional courage, not just individual responsibility. And finally, we must understand that the conditions that allowed these events to occur did not require cartoon villains or exceptional evil. They required ordinary people making incremental compromises, telling themselves that the circumstances were unique, that the ends justified the means, that someone else would do it if they refused, that they were just following orders or pursuing legitimate scientific questions. Understanding this is uncomfortable because it means recognizing that under certain conditions, with certain pressures and ideologies in place, many people might make similar compromises. But that discomfort is necessary. It's what keeps us vigilant. The title of our discussion today suggested that these doctors never knew their seawater cure was hiding a death sentence. that's not quite accurate. They knew. They understood human physiology. They knew that forced dehydration was dangerous. They knew that invasive procedures on weakened subjects caused suffering. What they didn't know or refused to acknowledge was that their actions were crimes, that medical authority does not grant license to inflict harm, that no scientific question justifies treating human beings as expendable. Their ignorance was willful, a deliberate turning away from ethical principles they had been trained to uphold. And when called to account, both at Nuremberg and in the post-war period, many in the medical community chose to protect their colleagues rather than acknowledge the magnitude of what had been done. The 90 men who endured the seawater experiments at Dachau in the summer of 1944 deserved better. They deserved physicians who would see them as patients, as people, as worthy of care and protection. They received instead doctors who saw them as experimental material, as means to an end, as less than human. That failure of medical ethics and the subsequent failure to fully account for it echo across the decades. They remind us why we establish ethical guidelines, why we protect vulnerable populations in research, why we must never allow expediency or ideology to override our fundamental obligations to human dignity. The story is difficult, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Only by confronting what happened, by understanding how it happened, can we hope to prevent anything similar from ever happening again. Thank you for watching this in-depth examination of a dark chapter in medical history. If you found this content valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more historical deep dives, and share this video with others who are interested in learning about World War II history. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future topics. Understanding history, especially its most difficult chapters, is essential to building a better future. Until next time, remember that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.